Christine, if I'm ever really depressed, I just want to hang around with you because you just radiate so much energy. My goodness. You know, I'm right to this moment, I'm not sure what would be the best way to use this time, so I'm just going to ask you all for your advice. There were two directions I thought we could go this morning, and I don't think we can do justice to both of them. One would be to talk about the pluralism question, but that came up a little bit last night for those of us who were there, so maybe we feel like we got a little bit of that on the table, don't need to talk about it. The other would be to talk about how we carry on the conversation about the first 9 questions without destroying each other and tearing each other apart. And my suspicion is that that would be the better one to do. I'm getting a lot of nodding heads, so that's what we'll do. Good, that's the one I had powered up here anyway. But if we want to, we'll have a lot of time for some discussion and questions, and if we want to talk about pluralism issues, that would certainly be fine. But this 10th question is where do we go from here? How do we talk about the first 9 questions in a sane and civil way? And what I am going to try to do with you all is I'm going to share with you a rather complicated, sophisticated system of talking about how human organizations and individuals and communities go through change. And I think this will be a little bit intimidating because I'm going to give you a rather sophisticated schema, but if you get it, even if you get the general outline of it, it will change the way you look at what's going on in our churches. I'm quite certain of that. And the good news is I'm going to give you a rather sophisticated version because we have 90 minutes. But if you want a really simple version, I took and simplified it in my book, Naked Spirituality. I talk about a 4-phase schema instead of the 7 or 8-phase schema that I'm going to try to share today. Somebody sent me these pictures, a person who does scuba diving. And so he was down at 88 feet and without any special lighting took this photograph of sea anemones. And then he had a full spectrum light with him. And that's what they look like with full spectrum light. But as you know, when you're down deep, there's a lot of filtering that goes on. So this would be all you'd see. And it's a reminder to us that where we are determines what we see. And often we're arguing with people about what we see, but the fact is we're just in different places, or we have different light sources available. And the same thing can look very different to different people. And so with that little metaphor in mind, I'm going to share with you a way of thinking about organizational change. Now, don't take any notes on this page because I'm going to adapt this in a minute. But starting over several recent decades, there's been a group of people working with a schema of organizational change, cultural change, civilizational change. And the first group who really pioneered this was a group working under the term spiral dynamics. Are any of you familiar with this? Okay, a couple of people. And then it's been picked up and adapted by a number of people. And what they did is they developed a very sophisticated color scheme to talk about different stages of development. And what a couple of us have done is we said, this is just, when you're around people who are deeply embedded in this, they'll say, yeah, that was, he's a very green-blue kind of a person. They sort of talk this way. And it just became so intimidating and hard that a number of us then just changed the schema to the colors of the spectrum. Okay? So I'm going to use an adapted version. As long as you know it's not the original version, we can work with this. And the basic idea is this, that if we look back on human cultural evolution, and we start with people as hunter-gatherers, living in little bands of people just focused on survival, there's a certain way the world looks, and a certain way the world, there's a certain light by which you see things when you're in that world. But then, and that's what we're going to call this red stage. And here, there's not much in the way of reflection or consciousness. You're in the survival mode. You're just trying to survive. You're not writing great works of literature. You're not thinking about the meaning of life. You're hungry and you need some food, or you're being chased by a predator and you need to climb a tree. That's kind of the stage here. We're going to call this red stage. And probably none of us are anywhere close to that stage right now. But if a fire broke out in the building, we need this stage to survive. We would go back to this stage right away. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. But when people succeed at that stage of being little bands of hunter-gatherers in the survival mode, then they start organizing into tribes and they develop tribal life. And so if you are watching on the Discovery Channel, and seeing a documentary about people who are living deep in the forest, and they live in these small organized groups, and it's just amazing how similar these tribal groups are. I mean, they're different in a million ways, but there's a similarity that they have a certain magical understanding of the universe. It's amazing how similar it is, whether you're talking about New Guinea or Africa or Latin America or wherever. And so in this stage, we're going to use the orange color. It's the tribal stage. It's a magical stage. I'm using the word animus because there's this belief that there are spirits everywhere living in things and places. Now, probably none of us are inhabiting that stage right now. But I bet a lot of us would admit that there are certain days when everything goes wrong and you start thinking about being lucky and unlucky. It's almost as if this stuff is embedded in all of us, And so that orange tribal stage, we spent, all of us, our ancestors, probably were in that stage for a long time. Now, what happens when you have a lot of tribes and they start getting organized with chieftains or lords or warlords over a lot of tribes? Then we move to this yellow stage, and this is maybe the feudal stage. It's a very power-oriented stage, super hierarchical stage, because when tribes are always fighting with each other, if somebody can emerge to bring peace among the tribes, then everybody learns the value of deference to a big authority, very usually male, and this is the great stage of patriarchal dominating leadership. Now, I think part of what we're seeing since the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan is a group of people who have been organized in this yellow zone. And we've been trying to nudge them up to the green zone. Ironically, we use that term in Iraq. But that green zone is what when we look at European history, we have the Middle Ages being a feudal period, powerful lords, warlords, who managed things, and they were going out to war against each other. And then power begins to be concentrated, and nations begin to emerge. And those nations have constitutions and Magna Cartas, charters, bills of rights. They become oriented, instead of around a powerful individual, they become oriented around lists of rules and laws and agreements that become our social contract by which we live by. And so our whole life becomes oriented around codes and rules and so on. And this is probably where a lot of us have spent most of our life. This is the native world for a lot of us. And my guess is that in most of our churches, this is the native world. This is the natural world. They see the world in green light, if I can say it that way. Now, what happens to some people when the nation state becomes a given, they start to build on the nation state. They start to build their sense of individuality and their desire to think freely, to be a free thinker. And now comes the stage of the differentiated individualist. And I think for myself, and this has a deep tradition in American history. This is Thoreau going to Walden. This is Emerson, of the valiant individual. Even Søren Kierkegaard, he in many ways represented the transcendence from just the groupthink of the nation state. And so you start to have this emphasis on the individual who thinks for himself and develops his own ideology. And my guess is a lot of people in our churches, when they go from the green zone to the blue zone, a lot of them change denominations because they join a new denomination as an act of free thinking for themselves, and not just living with the inherited rules that they came from. But when they come to the new congregation, guess what? They never are. They might leave that one too, because in some ways this blue zone is the zone of the consumer. And in some ways, when you look at the megachurch phenomenon, the megachurch phenomenon represents churches that appeal to individuals making individual decisions on going to a place because it's what they are looking for and what meets their needs. So all of the idea of meeting consumer needs becomes really, really critical in this blue zone. Are you with me? Does that make sense? If you really think individualism in this blue zone, and then everything is about voluntary associations that I choose. Then you see some people who that becomes their starting point. It's as if their parents raised them and they start really at the blue zone. And then they reach this stage where now they start asking all these questions about some of the assumptions of the previous zone. And this indigo zone becomes the stage of the pluralist and the relativist. In some ways, the indigo zone is somebody from blue who gets a liberal arts education. And they start looking at the world across time and looking at the world across cultures. And this is the great stage of relativism. Yeah, that's your opinion, but other people see it differently. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody has a point of view. And we've got to be careful about privileging or favoring anybody's point of view. So a huge emphasis on equality and breaking down the very hierarchies that got people that created the order that people live by in earlier stages. You can see that a person at that indigo stage isn't terribly popular with the people at the green stage. And you can kind of see how the people at the blue stage are a little bit caught in between those previous stages. Now, the theorists who developed this theory believe that all of these stages up till this point have something in common. And what they have in common is they leave the previous stage in a kind of act of rebellion. The word they use is they transcend without including. So they distinguish themselves by a reformation. We are no longer Catholic, we are Protestant. We're no longer blue, we're indigo. Does that make sense? There's a differentiation with each group. But then these theorists say, you reach a point when you're looking at things across the world, you're a globalist, a relativist, a pluralist, you're seeing all the difference. Now the big problem you care about is how do we get people to get along with each other who have such different views? So now you're facing a different problem. You're not interested in differentiating from the previous views. You're actually interested somehow in holding the previous views together. And so we're going to call this the violet stage. And here you're looking for a way to integrate people, to systematize, or not just systematize, but bring people together in larger social systems. And you're thinking about the inclusion of the other. And at this stage, this is a big stage for being concerned about the other. Qualitatively different at this stage because now you don't want to transcend without including. Now, I should tell you that people at the blue and indigo stages really dislike this schema because this schema is somewhat hierarchical. And especially at that indigo stage, you don't like hierarchy. And so for all of you at that stage, and I imagine we have a lot of folks that this would be where you are, I'll change the diagram in a minute, okay, to make it a little more palatable. But it is presented as hierarchical. And interestingly, the people at the violet stage start accepting the idea of hierarchy again. Hierarchy in the sense that certain things are better than others, or more well-developed than others, or healthier than others, because they realize, they feel that those people at the earlier stages will never get along with each other unless there's something bigger to hold them together. So that's the big insight, I think, at that violet stage. And then the theorists would say that there's probably stages beyond it. Maybe an ultraviolet stage where you no longer are seeing all these little pieces that you're trying to integrate, but you actually begin to see things whole. Your actual seeing, you don't even feel the effort of trying to integrate things. You actually see them in an integrated way. They would probably say there aren't many people at that stage, right? There aren't many people who see things that way. And we can come back to that later. And then some of them would say, and there probably are stages beyond that, that are truly spiritual stages, and that are in some ways just almost imagined or envisioned, and maybe touched occasionally, but they wouldn't say that any of us live there very, very long. And so in my book, New Kind of Christianity, I describe these stages using this color schema as a series of quests to say that in each stage we're looking for something, and when we achieve it, then we look for something else. So the quest for survival, the quest for security, the quest for power, for independence, for individuality, for honesty, and then I'm using this African word Ubuntu, or otherliness, or connectedness, and sacredness, and then some deep sense of union with God. So here's a way to think about these different stages. And in my book, Naked Spirituality, what I do is I talk about 4 stages that roughly correspond to these stages in a different way. And I use a different schema to talk about the different stages. A whole lot easier, simpler to understand. And normally, I wouldn't even share this. I would just share the 4. But I think if for a group like this, in a symposium like this, to think about it in a slightly more sophisticated and nuanced way will help us. And if anything, it will just exercise our brain to do a better job in our leadership setting. And so this view is it is a view. It's an evolutionary view. It says that we're really going somewhere. It's a hierarchical view in the sense that it says some ways of thinking are more advanced, more mature than others. But it's not an exclusive view to say there's only one section that's good. And in this view, a culture could include more than one zone, but it will probably have a center of gravity in one zone, and under certain circumstances could regress. So let me give you an example. Probably we'd say that the core of the United States is, using this color scheme, has been in the green zone. Or let me go back and put it in these terms. We're in the world of the nationalist, rules and codes oriented community. That's been our center of gravity. But consumerism and individualism and all the rest, it nudges us up into the blue, and we have quite a few people in that indigo stage. So we were in green moving toward blue. And then we had the 9/11 attacks. And we went to war with 2 countries who were in the yellow stage. And guess what? When you go to war with someone who's behind you in that stage, you act more like them. So our act of going to war with people put us into a situation of, in many ways, acting more like them. So I think we could say we've watched our nation regress a good bit in recent years. And the question is the regression over? Have we reached sort of our low point and we're going to start moving back up again, where our center of gravity will move up again, or not? We in the United States love to mock Europeans. And Europeans love to look down their noses at Americans. But part of it in this scheme is Europeans are working up on the indigo, in the blue and indigo zones, trying to, that's sort of their center of gravity. But guess what? They're in big economic trouble. And their economic troubles might force them to start becoming more green. So we're all, I think, conditions push us into different mindsets or different zones in this way of thinking. Let me just move ahead here. And so as we move from one zone to another, we first have to differentiate ourselves from the previous zone. We have to get some distance from it to be different. But then we also have faced the challenge of trying to integrate or including that previous zone if we're going to make it up into that second tier, into the violet zone there where we're not killing each other. So here becomes our interesting challenge if the kinds of things the questions that I raise in this book, those questions, by the way, in many ways involve a quest for honesty. So in many ways, raising these 10 questions, a new kind of Christianity, is very much an indigo quest. It's an indigo process. But at the same time, once you've asked the questions, where do you go? If you want to get into a fight with people and say, we're right and you're wrong, then you're in an argument with people at the more at the green level here. But now you start acting like them if you get in an argument with them. And people, often say to me, wow, Brian, you get criticized so harshly and you're very, very gracious. Well, I'm not sure I'm that gracious. It's just that I don't want to do green again. And if I get into big arguments with people, in order to argue in ways that will persuade them, I'll have to argue in a rule-based kind of way. And it's just not where I am anymore. And when I do that, I feel like I'm acting like somebody else. I'm not acting like me anymore. So I don't think I'm nearly as virtuous as somebody might think. I think it's just that my mindset is, I'm not in the nationalist rules and codes mindset anymore. There's no virtue. It just, my parents raised me. That was my starting point. And if you keep growing, then and if you're raised well, you're ready to move on. So I don't want to go backward and be in fights with people. In that first tier, though, you hear the language of us and them, good and evil, right and wrong. But when you start moving to that second tier, you start thinking in terms of appropriate and inappropriate, or adequate and inadequate. And you can say, you know what, that way of thinking is adequate for the challenges those people are currently struggling with. But when you start dealing with new challenges, that way of thinking becomes inadequate. And so if you think of it, sort of moving up the steps of this room or climbing a ladder, you have a higher perspective. You can see more each place you go. You probably can see some things less clearly the higher up you go too. But your earlier view at a lower level was not wrong. It was just partial. That's what you could see from there. And you start to realize that the skills that are necessary to go up to the higher levels depend on skills that you developed at the lower levels. And so each is nested in the other, each is dependent on the other, and you don't leave the old ones behind, you just add to them and build on them. So this is not an absolutist approach. It's not this is right, this is wrong. And this is not a relativist approach. It doesn't matter what you think. It's all equally good. But there is a sense of value here that certain views have more to offer. And I certainly see this in the scriptures so many places, but probably one of the best of all is in 1 Corinthians 13. And you get to the end of that beautiful passage, and Paul says, when I was a child, I spoke and thought and reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I gave up childish ways. So Paul's whole move, he's calling people from law to grace. Does that start to sound a little bit familiar with some of this? He's calling the people who are living in a law-based world whose mode of operation is violence and revenge and retaliation and revolution and that sort of thing. He's trying to call them to a different mind. You remember in Philippians 2, he talks about, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ. And he speaks of the way of love. It's not just a destination, it's a pathway that calls you higher and higher. So I think this might give you a schema to think about your own life, your church, your denomination. We can think about our nation. We can think about a number of these different struggles. And if you don't like the idea of something being linear, it might help you to think of it being an ascending spiral. And some folks where I spoke were so upset with the hierarchical dimension of this that they said, flatten it, you know. And then they sent this to me to say what they thought it should be. And if you like that better, that's just fine. That's right. Because if I'm working in the violet stage, I don't have a problem with people doing things in different ways, right? So there's a way to think about this. And I don't mean to overcomplicate things, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen this sort of an organizational diagram where you have a kind of a cyclical period of ascent and decline. People often talk about the life cycle of an organization. And so you have ascent, decline, and there's a certain point in the decline where you need people to start envisioning the next ascent. And then you assume that will go through that kind of process too. Well, one way to think about it is think of that first ascent, that first peak on the left, maybe as being the green zone. And then as that stops working so well, then you have people who start to imagine a blue zone. And then as that starts not working so well, you'll have other people who will become the pioneers of the indigo zone and so on. And you could think of it, if that helps you to think of it in sort of a linear, horizontal way, that could work as well. So that raises a fascinating question then. How do we help people in our context? How do we accept that they are where they are, and there are reasons they are where they are, and it's not wrong for them to be where they are? Once we can start accepting this, it makes us look at the process of change in different ways. And I guess we're all thinking about Steve Jobs. And one of my favorite Steve Jobs quotes, I didn't see it then, but it turned out that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life. And you can sort of feel that. And I think that's what a transition from one zone to another feels. It's really hard keeping this green thing going. It's a hard burden, but we got to do it. And then you, in a sense, leave that zone and you feel, wow, I'm a beginner at this new blue zone. And then you work that for a while and it starts to feel heavy. And then you get a breakthrough again. I think that it certainly matches a lot of people's experience. But let me go back to maybe this, just to give you those words. And I'll stop there and let's just play around with this. What does that make you think? What questions does it raise? So let's work with it. Yeah.
I can't help but ask Brian if this was designed. I see so many similarities in the chakra system, the energy system of the body in the Eastern tradition. Yeah. It correlates pretty well, I think, and I wondered. You
know, the people who designed this, I don't think we're thinking about that.
That's pretty amazing.
I think it is quite fascinating to watch how in different cultures we see that there are similar patterns at work. So I think we shouldn't be surprised that you end up with resonances like that.
Yeah.
But it is kind of interesting, isn't it?
It is, and thinking of the straight up or the circle,
yeah.
You know, things, when the chakras are all in balance, everything's in balance, and some can be deficient or excessive, and that that plays into the spiral of things coming and going.
Yeah, and if you're not familiar with what she's referring to, it's a way, in many ways, it uses different zones of the body to think about higher and lower forms of they would say energy, and we might hear us talk in terms of mindsets or drives or whatever. But I think you're right. It is an interesting resonance. Yes?
In the individualistic, are you talking about the selfish individualism we're going through in the country right now, where everybody wants out for themselves?
Well, let's that's the way a green or indigo person might describe it. Okay, but a person in the blue zone would say, no, this is about self-actualization, self-interest. It's not selfish. It's having personal boundaries. That would be the language you would talk a lot about in the blue zone. So it's not necessarily selfish, but maybe when it goes a little sour, it starts to look selfish. Yeah.
I served at a church up in Pennsylvania for 9 years, and we did a inner city camp. It was called Camp Creation. And it started out with different denominations, because what we did a camp in an area that was known for drug trafficking, and we took over a playground and reclaimed it and all that stuff. And during one of the years, the Jewish synagogue said they wanted to be a part of it, and so they joined. And when they did, we lost a couple churches that felt, we're going to water down the gospel now that the synagogue is a part of this. And so I decided to have a meeting, and one of the things that we talked about at the meeting was putting religion aside and introducing faith to the children in that area, because faith is about relationships, faithfulness and all that. And so when we did that, we also lost a couple other churches because they said, oh, see, the other churches are right, we're watering down the gospel. But what we found out was that when we put religion on the back burner and focused on faith, what our faith was about and that faithfulness within, we were able to move between the Tanakh and the New Testament very easily. I mean, even the synagogue felt comfortable with that, and it worked very well. During one of these stages, is it going to be a need to either put religion on the back burner or jettison it and just focus on faith and what those relationships are about?
Your first name?
Tim.
Tim, what a fantastic question. And I might fail at making this clear, but using this schema, you would never say it the way you just said it. But I think you're onto something. But here's the issue. When you distinguish religion from faith, and a lot of people would, when you distinguish religion from faith, and people might distinguish religion from spirituality, what you're in a sense doing is you're allowing the people at the green stage to define religion. And you're acknowledging that most of our religious institutions are probably, their center of gravity is at the green stage. And so when you use the word faith, you're needing to use a term other than religion, because the only way of being religious that people are aware of is the green way of being religious. Our set of rules, our label, our flag, our identity, and not theirs. But what becomes fascinating is when you imagine the possibility that our religions are where they are. Their center of gravity is where it is. But 50 years from now, it's going to be at a different place than where it is now, perhaps. It could be farther back, it could be farther forward. But when that happens, the word religion stops being the problem, and there becomes a way. And I think this is, in fact, it's part of what I'm writing about in this on this book about Christian identity in a multi-faith world. How do you have identity that's strong at the violet stage? And what one way to say it is your green people were worried that if you move to a blue or indigo stage, you water down the gospel, which means you reduce Christian identity, and you start to become just sort of a bland, faith spiritual person with no Christian identity. And in fact, I think I can picture this in terms of our larger national history. if we go back to the Middle Ages, then we're going to say in the Middle Ages, the church was in that yellow zone. It was a feudal, hierarchical, power-oriented system, right? And a guy like Martin Luther comes along, and especially John Calvin and others, and they start to imagine, they make a break, and they start to imagine the church as a red, orange, yellow, green organization. And wouldn't you say that's how our denominations are set up? They're set up with book of order or doctrinal statements. We've got everything in good green fashion of laws and policies and manuals and so on. And so this now has become our center of gravity. And for groups like Lutherans and Methodists and Episcopalians, you retained some of the structure here even as you moved here, because you still have bishops. And bishops in many ways are part of the structure of this church that you retain, but you created ways to move more into the green zone. Now, I think what happened though is at this juncture, and this juncture is happening between, by the way, yesterday I said 1519, my math was wrong, but from 1517 to, and if we take the 30 Years' War from about 1610 to 1640, so I'm going to put 1640 here, this is a period of violent religious clashes between these two groups. And it's no accident that this is the period in which the seminal thinking develops. And if we put, right here, 1776, our nation is born in the aftermath of this time of religious violence. And what happens in between here, I think, is a group of blue people come and they say religion doesn't work back here. Religion carries too much violence. And so they envision a zone that we call the secular. And we separate church and state, and the state becomes the zone of the secular. And what we work with here is not religion, but reason. And so one part of the blue zone invites people into this space and what we want to do is, in fact, the motto of the Enlightenment, this is the Enlightenment mentality, is reasonable, and I'm just going to tell it like it is here, reasonable men will agree. Women weren't considered reasonable very much yet here, which you might say calls this whole proposition into question. But anyway, but it's not religious men will agree. That would have been said back here. It's reasonable men will agree and will achieve peace through going into this neutral zone of reason. And I think in a discussion like the one you're having, in some ways we're saying, let's leave all of our religious particularity aside and try to find a place where now it's people of faith can agree, but not religious people can agree. And I'm not disagreeing with your impulse in that. I think it's a fascinating impulse. But I think this describes some of our struggle right now. My personal belief is that the Jewish folks who came to join you probably get it better. They're probably functioning more in the indigo-violet zone, using this language. And for them, when they think about joining with Christians to create to reclaim a park, they're not worried about their Jewishness being watered down. Their identity isn't under threat through cooperation. Yeah.
They kept on bringing up the word righteousness,
Yeah.
right relationships. That's what they were concerned about more than anything else.
And we could probably explain that in terms of probably that really starts to work in terms of that violet zone of Ubuntu, togetherness, which requires justice and so on. So I think I was rambling there, but all that's to say that story describes this very much and describes these struggles very much. Yes?
Lance Anderson. Julian Baggini as a British philosopher, he's got a very clever little book called The Pig Who Wanted to Be Eaten. And it's a number of philosophical puzzles. And one of the ones that he comes up with is the difficulty or the problem with being a true multiculturalist requires that, which one would assume would be if that's what you're trying to be, you believe it to be the best way to live your life, requires other people to be monoculturalist. When everyone's multiculturalist, no one is. And so, I see quite a bit of this built into the schema. And I'm just wondering, how do you defend against the kind of zoo mentality that it portrays? Because if you're in that second tier, the violet and ultraviolet, you're required to have all the other colors so that there is another. So that there is something to be unified. If everyone were in that second tier, there's nothing to unify. It is united. There is no other.
I think you just described using, first of all, you just described using this scheme, the difference between violet and ultraviolet, right? And this scheme, because that holistic unifying sense is that it's just taken as a given then, that there is unity. You don't even see the division. So if that happened, I think you would just describe what it would look like to move to that other stage. And no doubt there'd be new problems that would arise there. We can't even imagine what those problems would be because we're so far from being there. But what was the name of the philosopher again?
Julian Baggini.
Baggini. So I have never read Baggini, but here's my guess. He is accurately describing the paradox of this indigo stage. Because, as you say, the indigo stage, in a certain sense, is banking off of the hard work done by people at previous stages, creating distinct traditions. And do you understand, if you stand apart from those distinct traditions, you say, oh, they're all equally good. Nobody in those traditions would say they're equally good. It's only the person who in some way stands apart from them in some way and says they're all equally good. Do you understand that's an inherently unstable position? And he's pointing out, I think, that instability and that, the paradox of that. And that's one of the things that drives people beyond that indigo stage to another stage that says, look, I think you see that other stage in the story of a friend of mine. Some of you would know the name Eboo Patel. Eboo is from India originally and is Muslim. He's from the Ismaili Muslim community. So everybody knows about Sunni and Shiite, but then there's also Ahmadiyya and Ismaili. There's a number of other smaller groups. His parents moved to the U.S. He grew up on the west side of Chicago, where growing up he was a victim of a lot of bullying and a lot of racial and religious bigotry. And so when he was coming of age as a teenager, he felt the appeal of Islamic radicalism because his experience of America was they make fun of you for being brown and they attack you for being Muslim. So he didn't have this wonderful melting pot welcome here. He experienced something quite harsh. And he feels some attraction to extremism. But at that time, the YMCA, interesting, an organization with Christian roots, young men's Christian organization originally, reaches out to him as an at-risk kid and gives him all kinds of leadership training and leadership development. And so he now is torn between this world of the YMCA that's talking about serving others and caring for others, and this world of Islamic radicalism that in some ways is inviting him back into a yellow zone of a violent us versus them kind of thing, because the green zone he wasn't experiencing as a very hospitable or humane place to live. And right at that time, I believe it was a Presbyterian invited him to some interfaith dialogue groups classic indigo zone place to be. Interfaith dialogue is a very indigo thing to be into. And so he's attracted to this. Although he's also a little discouraged that it's all old people, there's almost no young people involved. And he's thinking, if you can't make this attractive to young people, it's not going anywhere. At that time, he and another Muslim friend are involved in some of these meetings, and they get a chance to meet the Dalai Lama. And they love the Dalai Lama because he just seems to be a guy about compassion, and they really are attracted. So they get a private meeting with the Dalai Lama, which is one of the peak experiences of their life. And they say to the Dalai Lama, we would like to become Buddhist. And the Dalai Lama says, please don't become Buddhist. We don't need you to be Buddhist. Besides, you can't be a Tibetan Buddhist, you're not from Tibet. He says, what you need to do is be a Muslim with compassion. And I think at that moment, that was their first experience of being invited into the violet zone, that in some sense wants to resurrect Islam, but Islam as a nonviolent and reconciling form of Islam. And so in an interesting way, his story, I think, plays out some of these dynamics. But there is, you're right, there's a sense that all of this is very time-bound. And the one thing that keeps us from losing those earlier zones, though, is we always are at risk of being sent back to survival mode, Yes? Could you send the mic up there?
Amy. I want to be really practical. You said, how do we accept people where they are, and how do we move people along? And as I'm looking at these, and I'm trained in the chakra system, I'm looking at questions that we need to ask for each stage. So at the red stage, the question is, for any church, do you feel safe here? Yeah. Do you feel safe here? For the orange zone,
I'm going to go back because really,
okay. Do you
this,
feel safe here? So the orange zone, really, you had the magical stuff in there. Is do you feel like you can be creative and fertile here? For the yellow zone, it's do you feel like you can have any influence here? Can you have your own self-will and self-influence here? For the green zone is have you developed a love for this place and our ways of doing things and our rules? For the blue zone, it's do you feel like you have a voice? Can you have a voice in this place? For the indigo zone, it's can you transcend all of that and help hold all our differences together? And then it's, can you transcend that? Richard Rohr, you were saying people that exist in that other zone. I think Richard Rohr is in that zone of, can you yoke inside of yourself with the holy other? So to me, practically, as we are looking at our faith communities, we have to start at the bottom and ask ourselves the first question. Do you feel safe here? Which, as you were talking last night about the tattooed kids that came into the San Francisco Cathedral, and would have been an interesting question to ask them. Yeah. Because if the answer is no, that's it. No further. You cannot go any further. And then if you feel safe, but you can't be creative and you can't be accepted as part of the tribe, then the answer is no. And then the third zone is if you don't have influence or you can't have any influence and you can't use your own center of will and power, then they're going to fall away. So to me, there are very specific questions that churches could be asking their members to help them see where they are in whatever scheme. Ken Wilber uses a schema kind of similar to this.
This is the same.
So I think we really could get very pragmatic, and it would be a form of self-evaluation for churches. If they could ask questions that would help them see, well, if people don't feel safe, which happens often in churches.
Yeah.
How you can't even move up to, do you feel fertile and creative and part of a tribe? I mean, tribes have to have fertility and creativity. That's the orange zone in the chakra system. It's all about, reproduction and creativity and all of that. So I think having questions to go along with each of these zones that churches could use to evaluate where they are would be practical.
Beautiful. And do you see what it's Amy, right? What Amy's suggesting then, first of all, it's helping people become aware that they are someplace.
Right.
And that
Right.
it's okay, it's good. And there are problems that being there is really solving. I want to come back to that in just a minute. Yes.
Actually, as we have all of these discussions, as we move through these colors and we, you
Yeah.
provide all the other, it automatically brought back Fowler's stages of faith.
Yeah.
And it's all developmentally
Exactly right, yeah.
related. Especially in our churches, it seems like Fowler's stages of faith can be a good starting place to begin that conversation of awareness building. Not that anybody wants to admit there are 2 or 3, I mean, it's like, I don't want to admit I'm orange or that I'm yellow, because now the blues and the violets are going to look down on me. There's
Yeah.
that sense of, I'm at a lesser stage or
Yes.
something. But if there is, like we said, the issue is creating safe space.
Yes.
Where those conversations can begin to occur.
In fact, this becomes a good place for me to say, I'm not recommending you tell anybody about this. I'm not recommending you try to teach this, or because for a whole lot of reasons, it's highly problematic. And if you're going to be in a church setting, Fowler stages or the 4 stages I have in Naked Spirituality might be a whole lot better. There might be other ways to talk about it. I'm just doing this for us to help us think about our role as leaders, because and to help us become a little more nuanced about what's going on, maybe to adjust our expectations, because a whole lot of us are forgetting that we are where we are because of our own personal story, because of our parentage, because of our whole set of educational and education and experience. And we're just so ticked off at other people for not being where we are. And a whole lot of this is about us all wanting to play God and remake people in our own image, and get them to fit in with our program. And there's something about this that you can abuse this in 100 different ways, but one of the things this helps me do is to say, you know what, people are where they are, and they have reasons for being there. Let me tell you one other thing about religious communities. Remember we were talking about institutions yesterday. Religious communities are always thinking about how where they are is better than where they were. So if I can speak to Protestants for a minute. What's the purpose of every Protestant denomination? One way to say it is, every green Protestant denomination is still trying to prove that you can survive without a pope.
Yeah.
And why do people love all of the denominational machinery? Some people really love it. Why do they love it? Because, look, Baptists and Lutherans and Presbyterians, we love our way of doing things because it gives us a way of functioning without having a pope. Mm-hmm. And that's precious to us. And when you try to fool around with that, people are really worried that we're going to fall back into something that we're very happy about having grown beyond. And until, this is where questions about safety, the questions about safety never go away, because people want to say, well, you want us to move beyond some of having clear rules and regulations and knowing who's in and who's out and so on. I'm not sure it's possible to survive. That'll lead to chaos. And so all kinds of safety issues and security issues come back again. And unless we can answer those kinds of questions, people aren't going to want to move from where they are. Yes?
John, we've been talking about societies moving through these various stages, and that makes a lot of sense. It seems to me, and I may be way off on this, but it seems to me that individuals move through these stages very much the same way.
Yeah.
And that only after a certain period of time and a certain number of experiences and a certain number of reasoning that we go through, are we able to move from one to the other? Is that?
I think that's true. I mean, that certainly is what a lot of us could look back and look at our experience and say, yeah, we see ourselves having a center of gravity somewhere, moving forward, a few steps back, maybe nudging up again. So then you start thinking, ironically, we're still living in the world that the big differences between a Lutheran and a Cooperative Baptist, where now we realize, no, the big difference is within Lutheranism, people in these different ways of seeing the world, and within Cooperative Baptists, and maybe that help you understand why violet Cooperative Baptists and violet Lutherans get along with each other with no problem at all.
Yeah, but the red ones wouldn't.
The red ones wouldn't even be thinking about getting along with each other. And they wouldn't be against each other. They would just be trying to survive. Yeah, it'd be a different set of questions that would be being raised. Yes. Another question or comment? Yes.
I've been trying for a couple of sessions now to think of a succinct way to ask this, and I think I've failed, so I'm just going to try and ask. But my name is Chris. Christina's comment a minute ago helps me a little bit, because I think part of what I need to do is confess that I'm at a earlier or lower stage, and what you said a minute ago about sometimes we want to play God and fix people and are mad at them for not being at the stage we're at. I am wrestling with things like Jesus dealing with the Pharisees not by accepting them where they are, but by calling them vipers and hypocrites and whitewashed tombs and knocking over their tables when they were excluding people. And about 6 weeks ago, I'm an associate pastor. I have been for about 3 years. Before that, I was a chaplain, and so I have that training and that impulse to try to meet people where they are and be the non-anxious presence and help them express where they are, those things. But about 6 weeks ago, our pastor was away, and I preached a sermon, and I ended with talking about the need for us to look in our own community at the modern-day lepers and outcasts that Jesus would reach out to instead of being with the elite and the comfortable. And one of our deacons patted me on the back, said, great sermon, and those were things that really need to be said. And then 6 hours later at our business meeting, as we were talking about the problem of having black kids from our neighborhood come and ride their bikes on our church grounds and play in our playground, he was suggesting that we needed to put up no trespassing signs at the church and put up fences and tear down the basketball goals and uproot the pavement so that it would be clear that we should have none of those horrible things happening. And so at that moment, my impulse was not to meet him where he was or understand where he was coming from, but to turn over the tables. And I feel, and I didn't do that, but I do feel some dishonesty every time that I don't say how horrible I find that perspective. So that's where I'm struggling.
I just think you just gave us a gift by just painting us a picture of what it feels like to be us, huh? I mean, we all experience that. I think that's beautifully said.
And I guess the other thing is that I feel torn between a responsibility to him and other members of my congregation that are anxious as they're 55 and older and have grown up in a certain world and feel threatened by young black kids with piercings, and he feels threatened by that, and I'm torn between some responsibility to him and thinking about those kids that I'm beginning to know that need a safe place where they're loved and they're welcomed, and balancing those.
Yes. First, when you mentioned Jesus turning over the tables and so on, I mean, again, this is just a little color scheme. It's, I think we have to take all these things with a certain amount of relativism about these schemes. But when you go back with this sort of thing in mind and you read the Gospels and you see Jesus interacting with people, I come away with, it takes my breath away almost, to say, this is amazing. You see Jesus with the rich young ruler. Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Why do you call me good? No one's good but God alone. I mean, what is he doing? Here's a guy probably working very much in that green zone of his day. See, one of the things about the Jewish people that put them so far ahead of everybody else is this emphasis on law. Because law says it's not just a person who's the highest. Law is higher than a powerful warlord. So you can see this very green mindset that's calling people up from just power-oriented warlords all the time. So green is something good. It's a big call upward. But by saying, why do you call me good? He's going right to the guy's world where there's good and bad and everything's categorized. And what does the law say? He's just going right to where he is. He's working with them. And it goes back a bit to Amy's comment about the power of questions to help people where they are. It's what good educators do. It's what Socrates did. It's what Jesus constantly did, asking good questions. It would be interesting in that, probably not in public because he might be shamed, but it would be really interesting to think, what could a question do with that fellow? To say, I heard you say that about putting up the fences, and then I remembered you patted me on the back after my sermon. I wonder how those two relate to each other. And just to raise it as a question could be a playful way to get him there. Yes? Yeah.
I'm Roseanne. I'm thinking about these colors in relation to this place where we find ourselves in America. Mm-hmm. And we're pretty much green, especially in the South and in the Midwest. And we find ourselves, or we did a couple of years ago, find ourselves with a new administration, which might be thinking in a little different zone, and went about the world saying that. Yeah. And so all of a sudden we have outrage and a huge disconnect at a time when there's also in our world forces to pull us back maybe to another level. Yeah. And so, how do we reconcile that with in terms of our faith? Because there are these huge, there have always been disconnects, of course, but yeah. There's a huge disconnect, which could be very dangerous for all of us.
Yeah. Well, we're going to live that out, aren't we? And we're going to live it out in the next in the next several months. And it raises an interesting question of what role churches and clergy should have in this. And of course, depending on where those churches are, they'll probably play different kinds of roles. One of the people who's a leader in this, one of the intellectual leaders in this way of thinking, I tried to get him a meeting with the White House a couple of months ago, or back in January, because I have some friends in the White House, to see if because one of the problems for the White House is if they're only speaking blue indigo language, and the people they have to persuade are in the green zone, if they don't speak the language of the people they need to communicate with, he'll seem aloof and distant, and remember, people say he seems professorly. So this is a lesson to all of us. We have to learn how to speak the language of the people we're speaking to, but not to be not in that way to be stuck in that language ourselves. And what have people complained about Obama these last several months? He's not fighting. He's not in there fighting. He's way too passive. Part of what they're saying is if you're working in the green world and you have to play by those rules, So I think we see exactly these issues playing out in front of us. But I think your comment brings us back very much to 1 Corinthians 13. Because if we think that Paul was right, and all of that about when I spoke as a child, I put away the things of a child, then that beginning of that chapter suddenly becomes incredibly important for us, I think, in saying, how do I deal with people, wherever they are, wherever I am? Because in a sense, love then becomes the ground rule by which you can call everybody at every stage to play, you know. So love is patient, love is kind, love is not boastful or rude. Love does not keep account of, it's not easily angered, does not keep account of wrong suffered. It hopes, it believes, it endures. So we start really marinating ourselves in a chapter like that to deepen our sense of how we can function wherever we are in a productive way. Yeah.
When we function in a world where there are many levels, I just want to say it's exhausting to do exactly what you just said.
Yeah.
I work frequently in a mission station where, and I was just telling my friends here, where, you know, they pray differently, they worship differently, their culture is different, and for me to find their language so that we have something in common, and yet much of my life is spent in a different level, if you will. And I mean, it's a beautiful thing to see that there is a tremendous commonality, but it's very exhausting to have to meet one group where they are and another group where they are, and function. Probably sounds psychotic, I don't know.
Actually, how many people would add an amen to that? The word exhausting, I think. And I think, you know, that's one of the reasons, one of the things that rest means, isn't it? Rest means to be able to withdraw and allow yourself to be where you are. And sometimes that means allow yourself to be where you are with people who get you. I just think that you're saying something that is very, very valuable and helpful, and all of us say, yeah, it is exhausting. And of course, I'm thinking about that, how exhausting it is for me to have to put up with people who are different from me, never realizing that I'm exhausting to be around for people who are at a different place from me. Yeah.
My name is Dave, and I'd like to look at a congregational sort of application of what you're talking about here. We're in a congregation that is fairly open, you know, and entertains a lot of new ideas. A lot of folks do anyway. But, you know, a certain number of the congregation, a certain percentage of the congregation sees the purpose of a congregation to bring people together intergenerationally, you know, build community, have a place where you come and gather and meet people that you know. The congregation is really too big for that, but they function in that percentage of the congregation in that manner. There's a certain percentage of the congregation that sees much more individual, consumer-driven programs as the best way to go. So we reach out to the community, offering things for much more individuals or parents for their kids. This is a program for my kids that will help them advance in their own life and give them some good quality and values that we want them to have. So we'll buy this part of your congregational program, but don't bother us with the rest. The other part wants to build community and include everybody and everything. That's a huge tension. Exhausting is a good word for that. You know, how do you operate in that world, I guess?
And maybe, I mean, in some ways, I don't think I can answer that question except to say you don't do it except without some exhaustion.
Well, you're right about that.
And part of the importance for people like ourselves who have leadership roles, whether clergy or lay leaders, is to acknowledge that there's a headwind and there's stresses pulling in all directions. And I think this is where, remember yesterday we talked about the different centers, the priestly center and the prophetic center and the scholarly or sagely center and the contemplative or mystical center. And my suspicion is that people who are working in these other zones have to find that contemplative center sooner or later to be able to begin to recharge. to find resources that keep us going, keep us alive personally, because it is exhausting. But to me, this is a place where, as Christians, we go back to Jesus and we keep saying to ourselves, Jesus destabilizes all of us. We don't want there to be a yellow Jesus or a green Jesus or a blue Jesus or a violet Jesus. We really want there to be a Jesus that destabilizes all of us and calls all of us to continuing growth and to virtue where we are and to continuing growth beyond that. And I think this is one of the great things about our text, is that the scriptures continually destabilize us and continually call us forward. They give us guidance that helps us where we are, but it never lets us think that we've arrived. And I think that's one of the great blessings of the scriptures. And it's one of the reasons why preachers, I think, our desire every week to grapple with the text that we have to grapple with is one of the gifts we're giving to the community of modeling being destabilized and challenged ourselves. Not just simply saying, okay, here's my text that I have to wrestle into where we are. But here's the text that that destabilizes me and challenges me. Other comment or question? Yes.
Diane, I'm struggling with the question of, we mentioned yesterday that a smaller church or smaller congregation has a hard time being viable financially. So the churches grow larger, and as they grow larger, they take on staff. Dave and I and one full-time director of faith formation and some office people and half-time people. But then the question is to not just empower, because we work on that constantly, especially with parents and children, but how to get people not to see us as the professional people who do the work. People always want to be in the Bible study that the pastor leads rather than the one that a layperson leads. Now, we made some headway with that, but still there's a sense of inviting other people into this same struggle, to letting them allow themselves to be destabilized. How do we proceed with that?
Yeah, I just want to go back and see if I can get that one version of this. Let's see. Actually, I want to use this other one here. If I can say it this way, let me be in this blue zone for a minute. And I'm coming to your church. Actually, let me be in the green zone first. I'm coming to your church, and I understand that you have classes, and that the classes are supposed to be led by lay people, or most of the classes will be led by lay people. And the rules for these classes is that we all engage with the Bible and we do what we're supposed to do. If you have the pastor in that system, you just messed up the rules. It's sort of like giving unfair advantage to one of the classes, because in the green zone, I want everything to be fair and equitable. So having the pastor teach one of the classes, it's not fair competition. So it's problematic for me if I'm in the green zone. If I'm in the blue zone, I could see it as being it working, because if I want to be with a pastor, I can be, but if I don't like the pastor, I don't have to be. So you're giving me freedom of choice. But if you shame me for wanting to be with a pastor, shoot, I'm putting my money in the offering basket. I want to get the best experience I can. Why tell me to go to get some second-rate amateur when I could get the professional, Or I hear the pastor all the time. I'd much rather hear somebody else, I mean, a blue person can live with that, as long as you don't shame him for actually giving him a choice and then he makes his choice. So I could imagine that working. I could imagine, anyhow, that's to me where your attention works out. But I could imagine it being frustrating in the green zone if it's like setting up a system and then having insider trading, for some unfair advantage for one class. Can I just say this, for all the Baptists in the room, this was the genius. Baptists worked green really, really well for the middle of the 20th century. Really, really worked green. And people were at green, and maybe here's the way I could say it. If a religious group gets slightly ahead of where the people are, so by joining that group, you gain, the group helps you move to where you want to go. I suppose if you want to go down and there was a religious group, then they'll also join you. I experienced this when I was in Denmark right after the cartoon. Remember the Danish cartoon crisis? And I was driving across Denmark with a Lutheran pastor, and he said to me, he says, "Yeah, we've had a big bump in church attendance since the cartoon thing." And he said, "We're not happy about it." Because what happened is all of these secular Danish people said, "Shoot, the Muslims are out to get to us. What religion are we?" and so going to church was like their way of saying, "Let's rally the troops for a fight. We better defend ourselves." And they were thinking, this isn't exactly why we want people coming to church. And we don't want Lutheran to mean anti-Muslim, right? But that's what people, and if there was a group that would have helped people do that, they probably would have experienced numerical growth. And I'm not saying that's always good, but I think this is one of our great challenges, is we don't have many churches that are helping people get to that second tier, and they're really, really rare. And when people use the word postmodern, my hunch is they're talking blue, indigo, and violet. They just know it's something beyond green, and helping people get to that next tier. We really need churches that can do that. Yes.
You talked about the church is moving people up to the next stage. I kind of feel like at our church there's a small group of us who are trying to move the church up to the next stage.
Yeah.
What's the best, because I certainly haven't found it, what's the best way to deal with that dilemma?
Yeah. See, and this is really a problem, isn't it? Because if you were able to turn what happens in the church service to the next stage, then there'd be a whole lot of people who don't feel at home there anymore.
Yeah.
And if you're saying, but you should feel comfortable here, well, they're saying you should feel comfortable here. So this really, what do you do with that?
One of the things we're thinking about, and just thinking about, is this concept of a church within a church, where we would retain the traditions of the Episcopal Church on Sunday, but maybe one evening, and we have a retired Lutheran pastor and his wife who are very much into the emergent church concept, to have them help us lead whoever wants to be into that next group, into that group, without leaving our church.
Yeah. Well, let's flesh that out. When you say church within a church, what I think of is something like this.
Yeah. So
this is sort of the Episcopal Church as we know it, and this is a new version of the Episcopal Church that might exist. And I think that's one way to do it. Mm-hmm. Maybe when you look at when you think in terms of this little schema we've used, you might say what we really probably need is, we might need multiple versions of this. It's not just one.
Yeah.
But remember last night I talked about the difference between a tree and a garden. And what I'd recommend we do is, instead of thinking church within a church, we start thinking of ourselves as having multiple forms of spiritual formation and disciple making that we're overseeing, acknowledging the complexity of our culture. And it's very hard for us to think this way. It's one step beyond this, in the sense that you're realizing when you do this is still normative, and these are sort of tolerated. But there's another way to say, no, we're saying we actually have to foster some creative space here for a variety of things to happen. And what that will force you to do is to say, what is the essence of being Episcopal? And it forces Methodists to say, what do we love when we love being Methodist? And when you say Baptist, what do we love about being Baptist? What is our, and the word I use for this is ethos. And the reason I use this word ethos is because it might have doctrinal dimensions, it might have cultural dimensions, it might have political or polity-related dimensions, but it's sort of interesting to try to get that out at the surface and figure out what is that, and is there a way for that ethos to be shared by all of these different groups? I think there would be some ways that you could create something here that would be destructive. They'd be mutually destructive. But I think there are ways for us to create that kind of zone. Let me just, before we go on another question, we got a few more minutes, but let me just ask for a quick little answer to this question. When you think about that, what about what is it I love about being Lutheran? What is it I love about being Baptist? I'd love to hear like 10 or 20 quick responses. There's no right or wrong answer, but it's what sort of leaps out from within you. If you can, and just say, what I love about being Baptist is, what I love about being Lutheran. Let's just hear from a bunch of people. Yes?
What I love about being Episcopalian is sort of not exactly the motto, but it's the middle way. It's
Okay.
And for me, that works in bringing all levels and all things together. Not everyone would see it that way,
Yeah.
but that is the core. And
Okay.
I love that.
Beautiful. Let's hear a bunch more. Yes?
Okay. What I love about being Baptist, and I'm a reasonably new Baptist from Methodism, but I didn't catch it in Methodism, is the priesthood of the believers.
Okay.
Priesthood of the believers.
Hey, just give us one sentence to define what that means to you.
What that means to me is that I truly can minister to others in a way that meets them where they are, helps them to come to a different level, as it helps me to come to a different level.
Beautiful. Yes?
What I love about being Lutheran is that I don't have to check my brain at the door.
Okay. Great.
I'd have to say what I love about being Lutheran is justification by grace through faith. A realization I don't have to earn my way into heaven. Now I can respond out of love instead of out of fear.
People check their mics and make sure they're
Turned off?
On.
Or turned on when you speak. Yeah. Thanks. Let's hear a few more.
What I loved about being Lutheran as a child, I'm Episcopalian now or something, but what I loved about being Lutheran as a child was singing Silent Night in German on Christmas Eve, and all the German immigrants, my family included, that were a part of that community.
What I love about being an Episcopalian is very similar to what somebody else said about Lutheran, not having to check your brain at the door. What I like about being Episcopalian is that to some extent we are encouraged to use reason.
Beautiful. Yes?
What I like about being an Episcopalian is that I have found that there are so many different expressions of how you can worship, and you can usually find somebody to help you explore each one.
Yeah, let's hear from some more Baptists. Yes?
What I love about being Baptist is what they say, you know, if you've been in one Baptist church, you've been in one Baptist church. I love the creativity and the autonomy of the local congregations when they are functioning at their best and most healthy.
Yes?
What I love about being Christian Church, Church of Christ, is that I get to pick from everybody's denomination and enjoy the liturgies of other people.
Yes?
What I love about being Baptist is probably similar to what Christina said. You can probably find someone within every one of those colors up there within our churches. So.
Well, I think that exercise forces us. It's interesting. I didn't hear anybody say, what I love about being Baptist is full immersion. Or what I love about being Lutheran is the synodical system, or whatever. And those things maybe play an important role in preserving some of these other things. But figuring out what it is that we love, that's the thing you want to make sure that each of these groups gets and shares to be a part of this. Yeah, this ethos or essence. That's right. Well, yes.
I wish you'd talk just a little bit. My name is Karen, about time, the dimension of time in this process of conversation. I come from a background in special education when I would spend weeks and weeks and weeks helping a child learn to count to 10, only to have to start all over again. And then I've been serving a congregation now for 14 years, Lutheran, a small congregation, whose welcome letter to visitors started off, although we are a small church.
Yeah.
They were apologizing for themselves, and it took a full 10 years for us to stop apologizing and to embrace who we are. So I just would like to hear your comments about time involved.
Well, this is one of the reasons why. I'll just share for those of you who don't know. So last night, one of my duties after our session last night was to come back here to the campus, and we had a wonderful meeting with some of the seminary students. And how many did we have? I don't know. Yeah, some 15 or so, 15, 20 students in that range. Really great group of students. So we just had a really interesting discussion. But when I'm with seminary students, especially younger ones, I always am urging them, if you can start something new, please do. Because we have to be realistic about the time frames of what people are capable, how much change people are capable of in a decade or in a lifetime. And so I think one of our great needs is to be patient with people and to understand that there's a learning curve that you can only get the slope so high in the learning curve. And a good educator can probably do it a little faster than a poor one. But some people who think they're good try to rush it and the whole thing. And then what do? They blame the students for not learning fast enough. And then they end up with a sort of deeply embedded shame. So I think this is why we have to encourage the development of new congregations. And the little mantra that I shared with the seminaries last night that I think relates to all of us is that new congregations can innovate. Existing congregations can imitate. It's quite rare for an existing congregation to innovate. And sadly, it's too rare for new congregations to innovate, because very often the leader wants to be a success, so he looks for something to imitate. There's nothing wrong with imitation. Remember I said yesterday that's how human beings learn. But where it becomes interesting is if you'll imitate 3 or 4 different things and you'll try to integrate them in an innovative way. That becomes innovative again. But what that does is it helps the people who start new congregations to understand that they're creating models that existing churches all through their denomination and beyond can imitate. So the full impact of every innovation is not only where it locally happens, the full impact is spread across the system. And it's one of the reasons why all of us in the room who are older need to encourage the ones who are younger. And in fact, just a quick story, since several Episcopalians spoke up. I spoke to an Episcopal diocese a few months ago, and this was diocesan convention, so all the priests and lay leaders from all the churches in that diocese had to come together. It was, 400 or 500 people, maybe a little more. And the bishop and the assistant bishops were all there. So I do some presentations and we have some discussion. And a lady stands up, priest, I'd say in her late 60s, early 70s. And she says, well, she says, I'm going to just tell it like it is. I'm a priest, and I retire in June. And this is in about April. I retire in June. And if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't. And I was like wincing. She said, there's one thing I've learned in all my years in the priesthood. What we're doing isn't working on any level. Now, that was probably an overstatement.
But it's true.
In her experience, that was what she felt needed to be said. But then she said, but I want to make an offer. When I retire in June, I feel like I've got some good years left in me. So if there are any of the young people in the room who want to start something new and experiment, you've got me full-time for free. And it went from a wince moment to this sense of, I was just this wonderful moment in the room. Because what she was basically saying is, I still got some energy, and I believe in what we're doing, and I believe in the gospel, and I believe in our ethos, but we've got to find some new space. To use the language you talked about last night, I believe in communication. Envelopes and stamps might not be the best way to do it, but I want to pour myself into helping something new happen. Now, we need the people who are going to keep serving the people who will never move to the internet. They'll always be envelope and stamp people. They're precious. Every one of them matters to God. If we describe them as a minority group, you'd understand that better than when you think of them as the majority. The interesting thing is they feel like a minority group, increasingly. They feel the world often is passing them by. And to care for them and minister to them and speak their language, to connect with them where they are as people in the green zone. That's a beautiful thing. And they need to be loved and helped and all the rest. But it's a mistake to think that the cause of Jesus Christ has to be limited to the green zone. We just have to make room for it to expand into a little more of multi-spectrum, full spectrum light. And that to me is maybe a good place for us to conclude our time together, to recall the words of John in 1 John. Here's the message that we proclaim to you, he said. Whenever anybody says anything like that, it gets your attention. God is light. And in God, there is no darkness at all. If we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. And he says the blood of Jesus Christ, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. We can leave shame, guilt, all the rest behind. It's so interesting. It's saying we can be who we are with all of our flaws and failures, grace, in the light. It's a cleansing light, not a shaming light. That, I think, is a great place for us to end. God is light. In God, there's no darkness at all. Well, it's been a great pleasure for me to spend this time with you. Thank you for your attention, your engagement. I come away so impressed and encouraged with the caliber of people who come together in Columbia, South Carolina. Thank you, Christina, for your organization. And could I just lead us in a prayer in closing? Christ has no body here but ours. No hands or feet here on earth but ours. Ours are the eyes through which he looks upon this world in kindness. Ours are the hands through which he works. Ours are the feet on which he moves. Ours are the voices through which he speaks to this world with kindness. Through our touch, our smile, our listening ear, embodied in us, Jesus is living here. So let us go now, filled with his Spirit, into this world with kindness. Go in God's grace and go in God's peace. Amen.